Good morning to everybody, everywhere where you are. Welcome to this webinar on the dragon, the current economic situation all over the world, with China taking the lead, at least in the narrative that is circulating all over the world in terms of who's starting first. We are going to talk about this issue with a number of well-known speakers from all over the world and from very different angles and expertise. The question very bravely is, will the dragon fly high, still high, and potentially higher than the rest of the world? Currently, it seems so, but there is some, aspects and issues that are not very clear in terms of potential and actual, not just temporary, but also structural characteristics of this restart after the epidemic or the pandemic. The global outreach of China, well, after or within, in the midst of the pandemic still, is within the narrative, of course, from China's sources, but not acknowledged by the rest of the world. But this is a very open issue, which we would like to discuss with our speakers today, which I will give the floor immediately after presenting them. We have with us Haiyong Gao, Director of the Research Center for International Finance at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences from Beijing. Hi, Haiyong, nice to see you again. Then we're waiting for Alicia GARCÍA-HERRERO to join in. She's been having some technical problems, but we hope she will join in soon. She's Senior Fellow at Bruegel and Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis, based in Hong Kong. We also have Mr. Niklas Svanström, Executive Director at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Sweden. Welcome, Niklas. Then Frans-Paul van der Putten, Coordinator at the Klingendal China Center in the Netherlands. Welcome, Niklas.
Hello.
And Frans-Paul and Cobus van Staden, Senior Researcher at the China-Africa Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs from South Africa. Welcome, Cobus.
Hello.
And welcome to all the virtual attendants. I won't take too much time from the speakers who have a lot of issues to discuss. So giving the floor immediately to Haiyong, who is very acknowledged about the financial policies and all the monetary situation in China. So we are waiting for your insights about the current recovery, or which are the main aspects we should look at to understand whether the recovery is self-sustained, whether it's going to be similar to the recovery after the financial crisis back in 2008, 2009, or whether there are different structures, features that prevent the current recovery from being similar to the previous one. So we are waiting for your insights, Haiyong. The floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Alicia, for having me here. Yeah, indeed, China was the first country to face the outbreak, and there are still so many unknown about the virus. So this is really a test for China, how resilient the economy is. And as you know, the first quarter was devastating, and the GDP dropped 6.8%, even worse than that of the US, than EU, and much worse than the previous one in a global financial crisis. And April recovery brings some hope. especially industrial output pick up slightly. And all three demand drivers, including retail consumption, fixed investment, and trade, stopped falling, but still in a negative territory. And more importantly, the retail consumption basically picked up relatively faster, and it's a very good sign that consumers' confidence basically start being rebuilt after the outbreak. So what has done? There are so many things. I just pick few very important steps. The first, of course, the top priority was to contain the virus. So China implemented very strict lockdown for almost 3 months. And it's fair to say that it is quite effective as far as the domestic front is concerned. But the effort was very expensive. And what I want to point out is that even before the outbreak, Chinese economy faced multiple challenges: the trade war, domestic rebalancing, financial deleveraging, and accumulation of the domestic debt. Many problems accumulating. So in the face of the coronavirus shock, the policymakers must act in a balanced way. For example, the monetary policy basically, has been relatively less aggressive compared with many other countries, but with a very clear target. So this is quite obvious if you look at the People's Bank of China's notebook. They targeted small and medium enterprises, which obviously is the powerhouse of job creation in China. And they cut the AAA 4 times since the beginning of this year, only for the small and medium enterprises, 4 times for large size enterprises. And also the People's Bank of China injected liquidities, by cutting loan prime rates, which link to the firms, the lending rate, and also the medium-term lending facility linked to the lending rate, directly linked to the firms. So by lowering financial costs for companies. But there is of course a debate. Many people argue that the central bank could implement more aggressive policies, but the major concern from the central bank's point of view is that, in the past they try very hard to leverage the economy, but somehow the domestic debt actually now is reaching a very high level. So they try to balance between this stimulus and, pressure for inflation, and of course assets bubble. Most of the time the Chinese, the stimulus goes to a real estate. So this is something, the central bank try to avoid. Credit expansion, actually they try to limit the sphere just with the real economy and targeted to some small and medium enterprises. The fiscal policy basically is still, a little bit less aggressive compared with many other countries. There's no mega stimulus so far, and the policies really help the household and enterprises. But there is an expectation that there's more stimulus on the way, because in two days' time, we're going to have the National People's Congress, and I think they will make decision for more measures, including to be more tolerant for physical deficit, like raise the target of the physical deficit ratio. Currently it's near 3%, maybe higher, like 5 more. And then try to encourage the central bank to issue bond in a way that you can basically just keep this stimulus running through the direct financing markets, not through the bank loans, just for the capital market, which is a very good way. And also encouraging local government to issue special bonds. This is something debatable because it's very needed, but it's because the debt accumulation, basically most of the debt in the local government hand. So those measures and includes the further fee cuts and tax reform. I think all the measures, physical policies could help the economy back on track. But still, we're not sure, because with this new expected stimulus, we call it it's an infrastructure stimulus, is something very debatable. But someone we keep hoping that there is some new ideas that we call it new infrastructure. This is a topic we discussed. It's not traditional, realistic or just the building bridge and houses. Now they focus on maybe technology, telecommunication networks, some new infrastructure, including healthcare services. So those kind of stimulus probably it's just on the way, but now it's just still we're discussing this type of which type of policies will come up. So this is something going forward. It's like it's very difficult to have a target, because every year China set a growth target, but for this year it's very difficult. Some people could propose that there's no target at all. It's better to have no target, but we don't know, and it really depends on several of the recovery conditions. One, there's no second wave. This is something we really scared. What if we have second wave, and this picture could be completely different? And then external demand is a major constraint for Chinese recovery, because exports just collapse. As no orders, or just postponed orders, or canceled orders, even though they get back to work earlier. But when China, began reopen the economy, many more others just start locking down. So this kind of, it's not in a synchronized way, which basically limit this synchronized recovery. And of course, the domestic driver is very important. The consumption, which we hope that could be picking up quickly, because consumption is a major driver for Chinese economy. It's contributed like 64% to GDP. And of course, the policy response, we need to have a decent combination of the policies, not only monetary policies, physical policy, trade policy. Of course, there are many more other uncertainties, not only Chinese side's choice. There are much more external change, environment changes, and Chinese policymakers have to be ready in response to those changes. But we need time to wait and see. And now of course China is leading the way to get out of this crisis, but still there are so many uncertainties. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Haihong. Thank you for your picture, which actually covered all the areas where we were wondering if there's been, of course there's discussion about, but there's been, expectation of having policies implemented in, a couple of days or weeks or so. So consumption, investment, and infrastructure investment was the key to recovery after 2009, real estate, transport, railways, all, transport infrastructure, which is now actually a number of projects in the domestic economy, but also going, cross borders to the neighboring countries. So a little bit, just I'm kicking in with a short question. Do you think that cross-border investment can help in this stage to get a little bit more demand and investment from for enterprises to as an option, not the only one, but maybe can they help?
Sure. Yes. Basically, the cross-border capital movement is very important for the whole economy, and especially the neighboring countries. It's not only the capital. You know, if you look at the trade data, you know, it's the general picture is like crashing, but the Chinese trade with ASEAN basically picked up. So this is something, you know, it's a recovery in a mutual way. It's on the one hand, the Chinese, you know, is probably lead a little bit ahead, and the neighboring countries, they pick up the pace, and then you know, it just start trading. So this is something really a good signal. And the investment, of course, there are many hopes because China is really trying to improve the investment environment. It's not only for neighboring countries, but for all other countries. And this is just, you know, China wish to get capital in the country, and they try to. If you look, if you listen to today's Minister of Commerce, the report, and basically he said, you know, we are going to do a lot more, you know, policies to, you know, nail down the negative list and many other policies on the way. So I think, yes, especially for the countries, you know, that thinking, you know, whether China is a nice place to stay, and companies, you know, they try to relocate their, you know, resources either out of this country or relocate some other sectors. I think we need to focus on, you know, some new policies coming up in the near future.
Okay, thank you, Haiyong. Thank you very much. So as we are waiting for Alicia García-Herrero to join in, for she still has technical problems, we switch now to our third speaker, Niklas Swanström, from the Institute for Security and Development Policy. And in a sense, it's the second pillar of our discussion today. One was the economic crisis, not just in China, but all over the world. And how can China contribute to, start the recovery in front of everybody, apparently, at what pace? And the other crisis, a kind of a reputational crisis. China has, dropped in for this discussion about where the virus started and who will be to blame for a number of issues that are still very open. We don't want to go into this specific, blame game, but how far, Niklas, would you see a reputational issue for China as, contributing to, shape the next stage of recovery? I mean, how do you see this issue, which is temporary issue of reputational problems and the so-called blame game, to impact on the general foreign engagement of China in the short term and maybe in the middle term? Niklas, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I mean, yes, there has been, it's going to summarize it, China has had a severe hit on its reputation. We see an increase of anti-Chinese sentiment, but at the same time, when you look at the Belt and Road, who will continue driving Chinese policy, I still see China being an extremely important actor. So, I mean, we will see more of the same going on. But definitely this has been damaging, and partly because of many initial missteps that China took, both domestically but internationally. There was a failure to communicate with the outside world, or even to hide certain aspects of it. And then the failure to sort of accept responsibility. And I'm not saying that Chinese government is responsible, but more to say that these have happened. We want to share information. We want to go on. And of course, now China has tried to use this now and to have some sort of corona-related aid, with looking at doctor, masks, and the sort of the whole Good Samaritan policy. Is this effective? To a certain extent, it might be, but overall, I do see that China's reputation will not be saved by this. It's not to say that, you know, China's economic influence or political influence will decrease, but that is also very much due to the fact that there's no alternative. Even if, when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, that I think will be the driving engine of Chinese foreign policy, it's estimated there will be a 30% drop in foreign direct investment. There's a 3.2 increase in trade in the first quarter with the Belt and Road countries, compared to 10.8 in 2019. So we see a significant problem, and we also see huge problem in investments in these countries. In, for example, Cambodia, in Sihanoukville, we have the port city in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, etc., that suffers from this current situation. But I think what is important to realize is that when I look at this, I see an increase of anti-Chinese sentiment where there already been anti-Chinese sentiment. I mean, the coronavirus, or if you want to call it the Chinese virus, the Wuhan flu, or the Kung flu, or whatever you want, you see that being politicized. Right or wrong? I mean, again, we're not here to, it's not a blame game, but I think it's apparent that we see this politicization, and on both sides actually, and how to try to use the situation. But I mean, of course, Ursula von der Leyen has been said that Europe is grateful for this support. The Serbian president Vučić has been more strong supporter of President Xi, and said that I believe in China's help and all this. But my main problem is really not the current coronavirus situation. It really is a much bigger problem. It's the Chinese development to much more aggressive foreign policy. We talk about the wolf warrior syndrome, where China is much more forceful. And even in China, there's some debate among scholars if this is a successful strategy, and I think it's not. So for me, it's the coronavirus is more a tool many times, a tool that probably will have a damaging effect on China's reputation, but it's much more problematic than that. And I think China will have to change its policy if it wants to maintain an increased influence and a positive influence, because I think China is absolutely necessary. When we look at the Chinese foreign direct investment, we look at the Chinese trade, it is essential for the development of the world at large. So I mean, I would definitely welcome that, but at the same time, what we've seen is a very negative trend. I mean, take my own country, Sweden, who has been rather positive towards China. And the last 2 years, the image of China, not Chinese, and I'd like to stress that, but the image of China has dramatically dropped. And we're now the most critical country of China in Europe. And that came much earlier than the coronavirus. So I think the damage on China's reputation was really before Corona, but it's been utilized by forces that want either to damage China's reputation or want to strengthen its reputation. That said, of course, I do think that I agree with some of the criticism of, that China should have acted earlier and all that. But so for me, this is not necessarily a new development. It's a new tool, but it's definitely not a new development. But that said, even if there is a negative image of China, what is the alternative? And I don't really see United States stepping in with President Trump. I don't see Europe stepping in with our very divided leadership and policies. In many of these countries, there is a reliance on China that has to maintain. Of course, regionally, there's a different issue, and I might come back to that later, but I think overall, there's a need for China to change pace if it wants to continue being as successful as it has actually been over the last 30 years. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Nicholas, for giving us, I think, a very nice picture of the different perception of China's reputation nowadays. And you mentioned the case of Serbia, which is, I think, a case in point, because it's really jeopardizing, if possible, even more the picture, because, the relations now with China are actually, I mean, less massive than relations with Europe, but actually the perception and the reputation that China built in Serbia, not just within the political elite, but also in the country altogether, is being stating the relevance of China and Serbia. So, I mean, these two aspects altogether kind of confuse a lot more, give input to the discussion, but I think it's very much confusing in terms of how, this reputation is being, used, so to say, to gain a foothold more than actual presence in the single country, in the individual country. I mean, I think the discussions are very, also the manipulation of information is kind of getting higher and higher. I welcome Alicia GARCÍA-HERRERO. Nice to see you again. But Alicia, let me give the floor to Frans-Paul, because I want to, follow up on this issue of health diplomacy, of mask diplomacy, that as being a tool, as Nicholas said, a tool in the same picture as before, to summarize your message, whereas some actually as perceived as being a kind of different tool in nature. So same Belt and Road narrative, but a very different angle in terms of trying to gain more presence with this dependence on the medical equipment, or and the like. So this issue of health diplomacy in around Europe has been mounting, and it's getting a lot of attention, not just in individual economies and countries, but also in diplomatic circles, and it's getting confrontational, as you know. So I would like you to tell us, what is your point, what is your view on the real impact of this so-called health diplomacy? I mean, how many aspects of this are just the narrative that is going to be over in hopefully a couple of months, or how much of it is there to stay, to gain a new shape of China-Europe relations on this health issue? The floor is yours, Frans.
Okay, thank you. Yes, well, I think it's useful to address this question by putting it into a longer-term perspective. So we see a lot of developments taking place very quickly at the moment, and it is indeed not easy to decide to make an assessment what is temporary and what is going to be have a lasting impact. But if we take a slightly longer-term perspective, we can see that I think, as Nicholas Svanström just already pointed out, the reputation of China, or the view of China from Europe, has been becoming more critical in recent years, and this has this has been having an impact on Europe-China relations. I think the build-up to the phase in which we are now on the European side originated from things that happened a number of years ago, like 2012 when China set up the 16+1 platform for diplomatic coordination with the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and the wave of Chinese direct investment that followed after 2012, and that reached a high point around 2016 or 2017, in combination with China's ambition in terms of becoming the Chinese program of Made in China 2025, so to upgrade the Chinese performance in a number of advanced economic sectors. So I think there's a number of sensitivities on the European side. At least 3 of them can be identified. One is, the first 2 are related to the 17+1 platform. So it's the sensitivity about China dividing the Europeans among themselves. So 17+1 or 16+1, and which nowadays is called 70+1 because Greece joined, has been regarded, I think, particularly negatively in Brussels at the European Commission as a potential attempt by China to divide Europe. The other sensitivity relates to the Western Balkan countries, which are not part of the European Union, but which the European Union regards as a special sphere of influence. And there too, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and the 16+1 or 17+1 initiative also touched on that sensitivity. And another one is the, especially I think in Germany, the sense that Chinese companies, it's too easy for Chinese companies to buy German middle-sized technology specialized firms, and for China to become to undermine the economic model of Germany and also of other European countries based on their successful technology and the ability to maintain export competitiveness. So I think these sensitivities were already there, and then in the past few years we have seen the relationship between EU and China becoming more actually deteriorating. I think an important moment was last year in March when the European Union or European Commission published its strategic outlook and identifying China as a systemic rival, which I think was a clear sign also for the Chinese side that the relationship between Europe and China is fundamentally changing and becoming less favorable. So I think against that background, I think that explains partly why the reception recently with regard to China's health diplomacy on the European side has been quite negative. When we talk about China's health diplomacy, I think there are 2 elements in particular that stand out. One is the fact that China, that is Chinese regional governments and many Chinese companies and the Chinese central government have been sending medical aid to other countries, also to European countries, and have been very, or at least some of these actors have been very open and public about it. This apparently has touched also the sensitivity on the European side, at least on the European Commission side. And the other aspect of China's health diplomacy that is particularly relevant is what seems to be a pushback by Chinese diplomats and Chinese media against foreign criticism against how China has been handling the coronavirus crisis. This pushback diplomacy, this pushback part of the China's health diplomacy has, on one hand, as a new element with regard to how China's diplomacy used to be previously, is that there are now more inconsistencies. So whereas China's diplomacy used to be, China's diplomats used to speak more or less in one voice. And now you hear some different stories from different Chinese diplomats at different times. And also the tone is sometimes much more confrontational than Chinese diplomacy used to be until recently. And the content of this Chinese health diplomacy, I think, is to bring across the message, not just to Europe, but also to other international and probably also domestic audiences in China. First of all, that China has proven that it has a successful governance model when it comes to addressing the corona crisis. And the other one is that international criticism on how China has been performing in relation to the crisis is unfair. Yeah, I think these are the two main messages that are being used, that are part of this Chinese health diplomacy. So the impact on EU-China relations is not favorable. I have to say that I think the impact is different per country, for European countries. So both the perception and how Chinese diplomats perform differs per country. But in a number of important actors, and particularly at the European Commission and also in major countries like France and Germany, I think the reception is not so good, and this contributes to an overall deterioration of the relationship between Europe and China. And we see two elements emerging from this. One is a much greater emphasis on narratives. So European perception is that the Chinese narrative is very strong, and there are some problems with the Chinese narrative, so we must have a very equally strong European counter-narrative. And the other one is the emphasis on strategic autonomy, in this case, strategic autonomy in the sphere of medical equipment, so that Europe has to make sure that it has more diversified sources of medical equipment, that it is less dependent on just China for a number of these medical materials. So finally, I think looking ahead at what impact this can have on the longer term on EU-China relations, I think so. It's not going to be easy for the two sides to overcome this deterioration in the relationship that has been going on for a few years now. I think two main issues. I think one is the more fundamental issue is that, well, for the European side, now that China has been identified as a systemic rival, I think this requires Europe to figure out what it means, how to deal with a systemic rival, because it seems to imply that there is some kind of existential threat, not to the existence of Europe, but to the value base of European societies. So that would imply that China and the European Union cannot coexist in one global system. But how can this? How can we build a new view of China that allows us to deal with China as an economic competitor, as a partner in other respects, on the one hand, but to view China as a systemic rival on the other hand? I think that's a very important fundamental issue to solve. And then finally, on the more pragmatic side, how to achieve strategic autonomy, not just in the medical equipment sphere, but of course in also other spheres. If Europe is so economically dependent on China, and it doesn't seem likely that the centrality of China in international supply chains, the importance of China as a growth market, and the role of China as a financial power, that this will decrease to such an extent that Europe will not have this major economic dependence on China in the future.
Okay, thank you, Frans-Paul, for giving us a very different view, I think I can say, from Nicholas before. And so let me summarize a little bit, if I may. This health diplomacy issue is at the same time a new chapter in an old story of China, Europe, and all China, I mean, other foreign countries on an individual basis, on a bilateral basis, in a sense, let me say it abruptly, say counting friends and would-be friends or non-friends, which has been very confrontational these days. And on another perspective, it's just a way that has been increasing, awareness abroad on the high dependency on China, be it on masks, be it on ventilators, be it on whatever other equipment you mentioned. So in a sense, it's an old story, but opens up a very new issue. So it's both sides. Maybe this is why the debate and the discussion is so, at least seems to be a little bit confusing, because actually the perception in some countries about the impact of this health diplomacy is not exactly the same as, it's the same story as usual. It's very effective. So it's being impacting on the perception of China abroad very effectively. So thank you again. We will be back in the second session on this. And now let me go back to Alicia, if I may. Alicia, can you jump in to the discussion? I will summarize in a sentence the input by Hai Hong at the beginning. She was mentioning all the options that China has in terms of policy measures to recover, and she was making the difference between this recovery and the 2009, in between 2009 and 2014. Then there were infrastructure investment, there were real estate, there were experts, and all the transport in border and cross borders. Now with the leverage problem and the experts, which are not exactly the two to the extent that the rest of the world is, is not consuming a lot and importing a lot from China, seems that there's no specific tool that China can actually leverage on to, foster the recovery. So what's your view on this? How do you see it? Alicia, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, apologies for the delay. I had a huge technical problem, and I want to apologize again. On your question of China's recovery, let me put it on in the context of what has been discussed by Nicholas and Frans-Paul, which is more, will China make it through the recovery? Because, it's very important to understand how much you push for a recovery in as far as that recovery can help you recover part of that image that has been lost for a number of reasons that were discussed before. So that's why I want to kind of step back a little bit to say that the recovery is crucial for China, both for domestic and international reasons. So it looks like a battle, if I may say. The battle starts with who is most efficient in stopping the pandemic. So far, so good, China. Who is more efficient in coming to help, if I may say. And of course, I hear you well, and I may agree with, how others may perceive that help. But the point is, because that hasn't really worked the way I think was expected in terms of, that improved image, thanks to first how quick we were, we meaning China, and how much we came to help. Then the next step, which is crucial, is I need to prove my point that not only have I stopped the pandemic, but I managed to jumpstart my economy as faster than anybody else, with much smaller consequences in terms of economic cost and all of the rest. So this recovery becomes an essential part, if I may say, of the whole package of winners and losers in terms of soft power and the like. And in that regard, I think it's fair to say that China still has instruments to create this recovery that is very much needed to show the world that China has made it beyond its efficient, at least so far, for what we know, health policies. Now, this is why I think, given all of these domestic pressures and international pressures, China will indeed, and it's already happening, conduct a stimulus package that might not be announced in the way it was in 2008. And the reason is that the current leadership many times criticize that package. So, you know, in a way, they are trapped in their own construct of what shouldn't have been done then, which doesn't mean they're not stimulating the economy. They are. I think that the leverage mode is over. Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and ourselves, humbly, Natixis, have estimated China's increase in debt, in public debt, as well as household debt and corporate debt for the first quarter of 2020 being from 10 to 13 points of GDP. This is basically the US. So in my, you know, following my our estimate, if you multiply this by 2 quarters at least, you know, you're basically at 23% of GDP stimulus in terms of increase in debt. It's not all government debt. There is a lot of household debt. So it's not comparable fully. But I'm just saying, China is pushing. And if you ask me, rightly so, because if the Chinese economy were not to recover, while, you know, the US is doing massive stimulus and several countries in Europe and Japan and even India just announced a 10% of GDP stimulus, it would look absolutely, I would say, like, I mean, a failure, if I may say, in that regard. So I think it's very important to realize that China will stimulate the economy. But I want to add, and I won't take too much of your time, that this time around, the stimulus is not for the rest of the world. That's the big difference between 2008 and today. And the reason is that it's not an investment-driven stimulus only. The investment-driven part is mainly, as we hear many times in China, new investment. So, you know, basically digitalization of the economy, and no longer a hard infrastructure. And increasingly consumption. Yeah, we just saw, you know, a new package of vouchers, 2 billion. These are small numbers for China, but they gear the stimulus where it's most needed. Because the key issue is that disposable income has fallen. I mean, literally fallen, -4% is a huge reduction of disposable income for a country that was coming from 10% increase in disposable income. The latest data in 2019 was something like 5.8 or 6%, if I recall correctly. So, you know, it's a massive collapse of disposable income. Unemployment is increasing, especially in the migrant workers. So they just have to put money to the consumers. They don't have a welfare state, or they do, but not as developed as, you know, we Europeans have in terms of automatic stabilizers. So they need to find ways to put the money out there to consume. And I think they will, because eventually, you know, they need this recovery to kind of finalize this cycle, if I may say, of image, you know, COVID-19 related image. It's not all about masks, or it is, of course, very important, I agree. But ultimately, if China can show that the recovery is strong while the rest of the world is struggling, it's such a massive message for everybody. Even if, and I insist, they don't share as much. By sharing, and I finish here, I mean that imports in China are plummeting, -14% in April, while supposedly the economy is recovering. So either the two numbers don't, but I do see the economy is recovering. It's very clear in the data. You know, we have electricity data, we have all kinds of things from the supply to even the demand side. We just got retail sales, I believe Friday, very important point there. auto sales, which were coming from -44%, I think, something like February, and then, -18, if I recall, zero growth. We're back. I mean, it's not magnificent, but they are coming back. Why are imports collapsing? Because this time around, China is not ready. And if you ask me, maybe rightly so, because they need, for China to grow barely 1.5%, which is our forecast for 2020, they need to keep all of these stimulus at home. But that in itself is a signal for the world, even if we don't profit, if you see what I mean, of success. Because the rest of the world is going to have highly negative growth numbers this year. So they don't need to import, or we would love to, yeah, but the point is, I think just decent economic performance out of a stimulus that is kept at home, so, with very little imports there, will improve China's image. And this might not be the case of Europe, but I can tell you in many seminars here in Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, everything I hear is China will make it, China will grow. They may be worried about how much it will be for them, no tourism in Thailand, you name it, but they see the West, they see the US, and they can't repeat that sentence. They don't think the US is going to recover so quickly as China. So this is very powerful for China. And to make a long story short, this is why they will try their utmost to grow. They may not try their utmost to share that growth, as we're seeing very clearly in the phase one deal negotiations or lack of negotiations and the complaints that China is not importing from the US. I have to tell you, for Europeans here in this room, that the worst numbers in terms of imports are not the US, by all means. They're Canada and Europe. And especially auto parts are collapsing. And a lot of goods are being substituted from Europe, into the US, to barely try and scramble to comply with the 200 billion. They never get there, but something. For us, I don't think we will. I think this is quite dramatic for Europe. So we'll have growth in China, but it won't be for us. That's my last word.
Thank you, Alicia, for trying to emphasize that maybe the discussion is not, or should not be, only about numbers, 1.5, 2, 3, but the nature and the quality of this, recovery, whether it's more inward oriented, as you are suggesting, or which will make a lot of difference between this future ongoing future recovery and the previous one, which was more, say, China contributed 35% to world growth in 2008, 2009, but also through trade. So this is a major, input in the discussion that I think is also going into the so-called, decoupling, issue, but on the other side of the coin, if I may say so. So it's not the decoupling by the US only, but also China that needs a little bit of decoupling to recover domestically. Okay, thank you again. Now we switch to the last issue in the discussion today, which is the role of China's engagement in Africa. Everybody has been talking about this before the pandemic, and at the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was worried about whether the pandemic would reach Africa and what would happen. So this is a short-term issue, very serious and dramatic, but also links to a more structural and long-term issue, which is the Chinese engagement in Africa. So I give the floor to our last speaker, last but not least, Cobus van Staden. Cobus, would you give us your view about the role of China in Africa, but also the different African perceptions of China these days. Because if are they converging or are they diverging? I mean, how many voices are there in Africa vis-a-vis China and the like? I mean, can you give us your view about this? Because this is very much a question. We don't have answers in this part of the world.
Yes, it's a very big issue. There's a divergence of voices in Africa on China in general, and in fact, the relationship that Africa has with China is very complicated. Excuse me. But that complication has actually increased a lot due to the crisis. So a few points. In the first place, the relationship between China and Africa is very much dependent on trade, particularly the trade of commodities. That trade has collapsed over the last few months due to the crisis. So that's both a collapse in the trade of raw commodities from Africa, and you have situations where oil, for example, is piling up in harbors in Africa to the extent that there isn't enough space to store it, because none of it is going to China. And at the same time, the trade from China into Africa of mostly finished goods is also collapsed at the moment. So there is the problem with retail economies in Africa, kind of like running shortages all across whole different kinds of supply chains because nothing can come from China. Then at the same time, this political crisis is increasingly morphing into, or this economic crisis is increasingly morphing into a political crisis. With at the same time, a lot of worry in Africa about how they're going to be paying for all of the mitigation of the pandemic. And that then spilling over into lots of discussions about the influence of Chinese debt in Africa. So in the first place, China has made a lot of efforts to donate needed equipment and treatment, and also sending medical teams to Africa. And there, China is a kind of a shorthand for many Chinese actors, and these include the government, private organizations, the philanthropic foundations related to private organizations. This particularly the Jack Ma Foundation is very big there. Jack Ma has arranged for several big flights of PPE to go to Africa. It also includes medical teams being sent from China. So all of that is happening. And for a while, that was the main diplomatic story, was essentially this China using help to Africa as a way to try and kind of step into this global leadership role. However, it became a lot more complicated when it became clear that as part of a mismanaged part of mitigating COVID, a renewed outbreak of COVID-19 in Guangzhou, there was local officialdom started putting pressure on local businesses and local landlords, which led to the mass expulsion of many members of the African community in Guangzhou, which led to a diplomatic crisis which is not finished. We've seen particularly the government of Nigeria summoned the Chinese ambassador and had a session with him, kind of berating the treatment of Nigerians, and that session was put on video and circulated on social media, which was unprecedented. And then, the Nigerian House of Representatives has announced a measure, or they've tabled a measure that would include investigation of all these businesses, Chinese individuals in Nigeria to check their immigration status, which is another massive diplomatic crisis. So that is happening while China is trying to position itself as this kind of global helper. And you also see increasingly African governments being drawn either by the United States or by China, or both at the same time, into the kind of diplomatic fight around the origin of the virus. So that adds another level of noise to the situation. The most critical problem at the moment has to do with debt. So China is Africa's largest bilateral lender. About 20% of African debt is to China. And at the same time, Africa is also increasingly in trouble with debt, with Eurobond debt and other commercial debt. And so there's been a movement now led by the UN Economic Commission for Africa to bring African governments together to negotiate a kind of a big rescheduling of African debt in order so that the debt repayments can be rerouted into COVID-19 mitigation. So they essentially put together a proposal for a kind of a freezing and halting and repackaging of African debt into something that resembles a collateralized debt obligation, which would essentially allow African countries to have a holiday on repayment without facing downgrades or facing anything that looks like default. That measure is increasingly looking very shaky. But they had a meeting with Eurobond holders last week, in which it came out that a lot of the lenders aren't very interested in that measure, and also the Chinese government have also indicated that they prefer to negotiate this on a case-by-case basis, which essentially means that these would have to be negotiated over and over and over with 54 different countries, which is a disaster. We're already seeing countries being threatened with credit downgrades, and with even if there is a debt deal reached, some of them might still face downgrades. So as the countries have very, very little time, and if China doesn't step into more of a leadership role in which they actually are willing to talk with UNECA or with the African Union or with other kind of multilateral bodies to try and get a debt deal going more quickly, if they actually insist on doing it country by country with all these little countries, then the continent faces simply running out of time, and then essentially kind of having like very long-term kind of problems with downgrades and possible defaults. So that, I think, is actually the biggest issue in the China-Africa relationship at the moment.
Well, it's not very reassuring what you've been saying, but maybe the COVID-19 is going to be as much as a health issue as a political and economic issue, and we will see which weight is the biggest among the three of these pillars of the COVID crisis. I'm not sure if the health pillar will be the heaviest at the end of the day. To the extent that this opens up old problems and adds new issues to old problems, and apparently solutions are not being found. If we think that the highly indebted developing countries are still in the same status, official status of highly indebted developing countries since ages. So this adds to the picture. So thanks to everybody. We have been gathering a lot of questions. We will never be able to go through all of them, but we are merging some questions according to the topics. Let me go through them and read them to you, although this is a little bit cumbersome, but let me do this way to save on time. So I have an economic question for our two ladies from China, Haiyong, Alicia. The question is, how does China assess the sentiment among Western companies to restructure supply chains and the consequent economic decoupling? How much does Chinese consumption need to go up from current levels of 66% to counter for economic decoupling? Big issue, big question. Do you want to share your views about this, which is, you know, something we tackled before, but not as, you know, specifically as the question seems to ask. Wants to start first? Hayong, Alicia, you decide.
Well, I go with the consumption, and I think Alicia will go with the supply chain. You have a lot to say. So basically, a consumption story is a not new story. If you look at the data, basically, I think the contribution of consumption to GDP overtook fixed income and trade, at least since 2013. So this is something is going on and will continue, which of course reflect the nature of the market because of the size and the population, and it's a part of the effort of a rebalancing. And if you look back how it happened, you know, we've learned as economists, we've learned some theories like, you know, it's a very famous one, we call it Samuelson Hypothesis, which means that if you have an economic growth and then can transmit it into a higher income, and then you could consume more. This is something, you know, happening in China now. So this is a very natural process, a part of the rebalancing. And the major challenge is that you have to make sure people feel safe, you know, because, you know, normally Chinese have a relatively high saving rates. And why? Because they have to save. There are a lot of problems with this social care system and also, you know, maybe related to culture, but somehow they just save for future, and it's sort of repressing consumption, you know, today. But I think the government, basically the policy, from policy side, they fully aware of this aspect, and I think they were going to, you know, even within the stimulus, they will put money in this social care policies and to improve the safety. And then gradually, I think, because consumption is about confidence. So I think this is very important. If your people feel confidence, they will consume, they spend, go shopping. And now I think China is on the right way. And of course, I would like to respond to Alessia's point, the sharing, the inward, you know, recovery. But basically, I think because if the consumption will be the driver of this, you know, the whole recovery scenario, and then certainly it's a good sharing. Well, of course, this is kind of a two-way attitude. China keep it open. The market is open. If you read, you know from scholars, from well, the policymakers, I think a very clear message. They want to keep the country open. So this is something, you know, China want to share. The issues whether the rest of the world want to share with China. So this is something related to the discussions we discussed with some other panelists. And well, it's completely out of the economic sphere. And so I think, well, from an economic point of view, I'm quite optimistic about this. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Hayong. Alicia, do you want to follow up on this very last point from Haiyong, that
Yes.
China is open to the rest of the world? Let's see if the rest of the world is open on China. About supply chain, how do you see that? I mean, is it really a decided decision or what?
Well, I want to say two things. I frankly think the world is more open to China than China is open to the world, economically speaking. And there's many ways to measure this. It's not just a leap of faith that I'm. The first way to measure this is really the number of sectors that are fully open to foreign competition in China as opposed to the rest of the world. That's the very first way to do it. Of course, it's great, and I agree with Haiyong that there's been announcements, especially on the financial sector, of further opening, which are welcome, but the level of openness is still not comparable, at least between the EU and China. We can talk about, India or increasingly, unfortunately, the US going backwards. But if we compare Europe and China, I think there's no doubt. On imports, the data is very telling. China's imports of intermediate goods for re-exports, which is this narrow definition but very useful definition of global value chain as offered by UNTAD, is shrinking, and it has been shrinking in China for the last probably 6 to 7 years. So China is vertically integrating. I'm not blaming China, because maybe if I were China, I would also try to do the very same thing, especially given how the US is reacting. Yeah, I mean, think about it. If I put my Chinese hat now, well, thanks God I did that, because they're cutting my supplies. Was just reading while Haiyong was one tweet I had this morning on the obvious fact that everybody, I think, is quite shocked about this. The US is cutting supplies, semiconductor supplies to Huawei. What China has just done, and this was the news today, is to pump to not import from Europe or Korea or Japan, but rather to pump 2.25 billion in supposedly a private company, certainly listed, SMIC, biggest private semiconductor company in China, for them to produce. So, and frankly, again, I go back to the fact that maybe I would do the same, because if the US starts cutting, maybe others will follow, yeah? Pressure by the US. So it's not to blame. It's just that I understand from a perspective of a country that feels threatened, of the size of China and with its history, I can understand that it's not easy to open at the current juncture. We can talk about the past and why we got here, but at the current juncture, I understand that especially for strategic imports, you may want to produce them yourself. And that reduces the amount of import that China can really carry out. Yeah. So anything that is strategic or an intermediate good, essential for production, you may as well do it yourself, because eventually, well, first of all, because you want to integrate vertically, you want to add value added, and finally, because maybe you will suffer from this bottleneck if push comes to shove, and it seems it is happening. So this is the reality. I just think, and finally, on the global value chain, which is what I just started saying, that the reason why I do think there will be a shift away from China is not only political. It makes economic sense, because China today is 32% of the global, it has 32% of share of global exports of intermediate goods. This means, just as a comparison, double the size of China in GDP terms. So it's basically the value chain is now totally centered in China. It's not only medical components, it's many, many other items. There's a number of bottlenecks. We did a study for Europe, how many products were imported by more than 70% from China in different European countries. And there were many, many products. In some countries, these were intermediate products, meaning capital goods, basically essential for the production. So it's not really about, how would I say, national security. No, even by all means for economic reasons, because you need to have a diversified import of intermediate goods, so that if there is, I'm not talking about even anything just strategic, but even a flood, even well, as we had, unfortunately, a pandemic, any kind of asymmetric shock hitting the centrality of the value chain in China can create massive costs for any producer or any importer. So it makes economic sense, which doesn't mean that the whole production will move out of China by all means. It's just that as part of it will be diversified away elsewhere to reduce that concentration risk. That's all it means. And I don't think we should over politicize this issue, also because, by the way, China has become less competitive in terms of labor costs and other related costs than it was before. It's of course very competitive at the higher end of the spectrum, and no problem about it. But there is certain type of products increasingly at the lower end of the value chain that will be decentralized or reshored somewhere. Of course, the trick is when you hear the Taiwanese semiconductor company saying, I go to Arizona with 16 billion. That sounds a little bit geopolitical. I agree that not everything we see is understandable under the light of economic efficiency or diversification reasons. There's more than that. I acknowledge that. But I am just saying that there are good economic reasons to push a little bit of that huge value chain, which now sits in China, elsewhere. And I don't think it's to the detriment of China in a way, because a lot of this is already probably things that China may not want to produce anymore. And that's, maybe we need to kind of make it less, how would I say, less of an issue, this shifting of the value chain, except for the cases, as I explained, where there are indeed major geopolitical reasons behind, but they're not all of them. So yeah, that would be my call on this issue.
Thank you, Alicia and Haiyong. I think this clarifies quite a lot the many questions about the decoupling and the very origin and rationale of the decoupling, if there's ever be a decoupling, if it is sustainable or not. I think it's in the way, structurally speaking, not just for the political circumstances and health circumstances now, but also due to the over-dependence of many sectors, maybe we will be, ended up to a decoupling somewhere in the future, if not now for the health emergency. So maybe this accelerates some of the developments that within China have been taking place since some years now, in terms of increase of local content, of reduction of high-tech imports, and so on and so forth. So maybe this accelerates something which is not totally new, but it's been going on for quite some time. We have a lot of questions on very different issues, because the speakers tackled a lot of different aspects of the current circumstances and developments of Chinese relations with the rest of the world, on the economic side, on the political side, on the diplomatic side. We have a sharp question about whether you all think China will eventually comply with international call for an independent investigation on the source of the coronavirus outbreak. and could that help to rescue its image in the West? I think it's very sharp if you want just to say yes, no, or something, whatever. I think it's very confrontational issue. So I'll leave you the freedom to decide what to answer or not, and how much time to take. Whoever of you has.
Should I try to answer that?
You're welcome, Nicholas.
Yeah, well, this answer is no. There will be definitely a investigation, I think. That's what China will allow. It will not be the independent investigation that I think the international community looks for, because any form of international investigation could potentially also criticize the Chinese leadership. And that, I think, is really what they don't want to allow. So I think we will see an investigation with kind of restricted mandate, and I simply can't see that to satisfy the international community. So I think this is a limitation, and I mean, if I may, also we talked about geopolitics. When it comes to regions, if you look at China's regional neighborhood, especially when you look at Central Asia, Indonesia, etc., that has had a long, I'm not going to say feud, but at least they were starting to see China as a looming threat towards their national independence. We do see a heavy rise of hate speeches against Chinese people, not only Chinese citizens, but Chinese in general. We have sort of a politicalization of the coronavirus, especially in Central Asia. And I was thinking about Kazakhstan, where Governor Akhmetov basically said we need to purge all Chinese workers out of Kazakhstan because they spread the virus. And that was extremely popular. So we see, I'm not going to call it really the geopolitics, but at least a local politics that definitely uses this sort of anti-Chinese sentiment. And so that's definitely growing on in the region, and they will definitely ask for this investigation. And then of course, if you go to Central Asia, they would ask also for an investigation of Xinjiang and all that. But that's a very different issue. So I mean, regionally, I see this as a much more complex issue. But the two sides of it. Governments tend not to criticize China. Population tend to do that. And then, of course, we have a very broad variety of states. Some are very pro-Chinese and others are extremely critical. But a quick answer.
Okay, thank you, Nicholas. Anybody wants to add something to the very big issue of what also could be an independent investigation? That would be my question, but I don't want to take the floor from the participants. Anyone wants to add to the Nicholas answer, or shall we move on to Alicia?
Very quickly, I actually don't understand why we keep on banging with this investigation now, because we're in the midst of the pandemic. You know, why don't we just try to talk about how to solve this issue in a coordinated way? And then once we finish, if we do, we move on to understanding. I mean, I just feel we're trapped in this very negative discourse, which is not what we need now. And that is independent on, you know, what happened in a way. Many argue this is what we need to understand the cause of the virus. No, I mean, what we need to understand the cause of the virus is really to cooperate. So I just feel that it doesn't add to the value of cooperation, which we desperately need now. That's my take on this one.
Thank you, Alicia. If nobody wants to add something, Mayon, you wanted to?
So I completely agree with Alicia, because this is not the right time to do this sort of thing. We have our common enemy. This is a virus. We need to work together. So this is an obvious solution. So I think we need to think, well, we just just don't weaponize everything. So this is something, you know, it's like, you know, the political sentiment, I understand, is always in the way, but it is just not the moment. So I completely agree with Alicia's and also Nicholas, the points, and I think I echo the points as well. That's it.
Thank you, Haiyong. Let's move on. We have a question directly for Frans-Paul, and it says 12 out of 17 in the 17+1 are EU members. And I think, I mean, the participant thinks 14 are NATO members. I haven't counted precisely, but you will tell. Why point fingers at China if it wants to exploit internal differences within EU/NATO? Shouldn't Europe do more to rediscover the solidarity sentiment, or is it too large and diverse now to rediscover it and needs to blame an external player?
Yes, well, I think that that observation is, I agree with that observation. It's just that apparently the establishment of 16+1 came as a shock to some people in Europe, especially in Brussels. I think it's not so much about this problem of internal cohesion within the EU is caused by China, but I guess that some policymakers in Europe or politicians were shocked to see that the Chinese government is not taking into account this kind of vulnerability that the EU has, so that China is not afraid of moving ahead with its own agenda, even if this exposes and further worsens this kind of vulnerability that Europe already had previously. So it's this. So I think this contributes to the perception that a rising China is in some ways a potential threat to some vulnerabilities, some systemic vulnerabilities that the European Union has.
Okay, thank you, Frans-Paul. That would, in my opinion, would open a very big issue about whether it was a shock to the EU, this 17+1 now, 16+1 now, 17+1, because it seems it's there since quite some time. But anyway, this is a parallel issue. Let's move on to the questions. How the US presidential elections will influence the EU-China relation in case of a Trump second mandate? To anybody, I guess.
Can I?
Yeah, yes, please.
I think the main elements that are there. I think the basic pressure that Europe feels from the US and that comes from this geopolitical tension between the US and China will continue regardless of who will be the next president. I would expect that if Trump has a second term in office, there will be some things like more uncertainty. So it's the US foreign policy is less predictable under Trump. US foreign policy is more confrontational, not just towards China, but also towards the EU. But I think some of the big issues for European side, like the pressure that the US government is putting on European business to not to supply China with certain strategic goods, that this will continue under any next president's whoever is the next president. And I think also that eventually, maybe later, maybe it will take a bit longer under Biden than under Trump. But eventually, the message that has been coming from US government to Europe is increasingly that if Europe is not with the United States, then it is against the United States. So there is a decreasing room for Europe to take up a neutral position. We are expected to follow the US lead. I think this is stronger and will come sooner under a Trump presidency. But if Trump would not be the president, I think this development will continue anyway.
Thank you, Frans-Paul. And we are giving you extra work now because there are a lot of questions for you about China-EU relations. And one specific is the following. Last week, the South China Morning Post cited some EU officials being optimistic that a deal on investment between China and the EU will be signed in September. As bilateral relations are not at their best, so to say, what should we expect? Is it likely that China will subordinate the signature to an EU declaration praising Beijing's strategy? I'm reading, praising Beijing's strategy in fighting against the coronavirus?
Yeah, so the question about the EU-China investment agreement, if there's anybody else who would like to take that question, I would be very happy, because I'm not sufficiently aware of the status of the negotiations.
I can take it if you don't mind quickly. I'm not sure how aware I am, although I have conversations with the negotiators here and there. But I do have a strong point as to why. I mean, the question really very simply is why we would have to sign such an agreement in such a year, just because we have a wonderful summit. I mean, I don't understand. We are even delaying Brexit as a matter of force majeure, and we're going to sign an agreement that we don't feel very comfortable with. There's a number of red lines there from, I would argue, from both sides. So we have all of the labor, international labor regulations on the Chinese side. We have the role of the state-owned companies from our side, market access, reciprocity. I mean, we've been discussing this thing for so long. We had this wonderful concept which we thought could help us, which was being pushed by the US administration in its early negotiations before we even called it phase one deal, which was basically a watered down of the actual initial negotiations for the trade war, which was this competitive neutrality concept by which we could perhaps one day measure the degree of distortions created by state ownership in the Chinese production, market, both in terms of production of goods and services. Well, this concept has been politicized, I would say even has become ideological, if I may say, in China, and thus the US has kind of moved out or moved away from even discussing or imposing this concept. We have done the same. So there is no working tools at the current juncture, in my opinion, to pursue this bilateral investment agreement forcefully in time for the summit. But the reality is that there is still a lot of push. And I'm worried about that because, I mean, we started negotiating in November 2013 that I'm aware of. So, it's not that we're going to get anywhere in the next month, basically. And I just worry about getting this through as a matter of urgency, given what's happening. So my point here is, if Brexit gets delayed, I don't understand why this doesn't get delayed as a matter of principle. And thus, and even more so given that the expectations from the European side and to some extent from the Chinese side have not been fulfilled. It should not even be on the table by now, but it still is, and that worries me.
Thank you, Alicia, for this very clear opinion on an agreement which has been very debated because it should have been, signed before December 2019, right? I mean, in a rush to the end, although many years of negotiations passed and nothing was actually decided. So it was already source of concern and skepticism before this year. Now switching to totally different issue, a question to Cobus. Where do you see China's investment in Africa going in the short term? Will there be new spaces, new room for other Asian powers like Japan and India competing with China and Africa, maybe more than before? Or how do you see it from there, Cobus?
I think I think some of the big investments will, over the short term, probably slow down. We already saw some caution from China about large-scale investments, particularly infrastructure investments in Africa already before the pandemic. And I think the concentration of funds on trying to restart the Chinese economy is probably going to pull some energy away from that. That said, I think certain sectors are going to keep going. So over the last while, last year or 2 years, we've seen a lot of Chinese investment in African technology startups and a lot of investment by Chinese companies in African consumer technology as a whole. And then also a lot of Chinese companies being involved at all levels in technology and internet provision, including systems like smart city systems and some AI-powered surveillance systems. So I think that sector will probably continue. Whereas things like ports and rail and kind of like large-scale physical infrastructure, I would expect to slow for a while. I think there is already a lot of space for other Asian actors in Africa. Japan is a large actor in Africa already, and India, Malaysia, South Korea, Indonesia even are all ratcheting up their involvement. I think at the moment, because of the tension around debt in relation to Africa, I think Africa is also going to be looking for trying to diversify its partners. Because I think one of the things that has been revealed by the COVID crisis is how dependent Africa is on China and how much a crisis in China affects Africa directly. So I think there'll be a move towards diversifying its partners anyway. But historically, obviously the United States and Europe have been very big partners to Africa. But I think in both cases, especially in the short term, both those actors are very distracted, and they might not have the resources or the energy or the bandwidth to particularly work with Africa on new projects at the moment. So I think that does open the space for Asian partners to step in as well. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Okay, so from hard infrastructure to soft infrastructure, mainly, and do you think, this is my question, do you think, Cobus, that some countries in Africa with stronger relations with China actually became more aware of the burden of the dependence vis-a-vis China, or not so much so? I mean, you may have answered, but I think want you to sum it all up a little bit more precisely, yes. Because Africa, I mean, it's a continent. I mean, we cannot talk, it's just nonsense. But is there some example you see that has been, you know, very clearly changed the attitude, let's say?
I think we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years a country like Kenya, for example, moving from a situation where China was really, you know, its foremost partner, and where big Chinese funded projects were really used by the government as a way to promote itself, and as a way to point towards a new future of regional integration, because a lot of, you know, there were very big rail projects in East Africa where Kenya was at the center, that would connect Kenya to several other East African states, and all of that was not only funded by China but also built by Chinese contractors. Since then, those deals have become a lot more, there was a lot of questioning of those deals in Kenya, and then also Beijing itself then stepped away from financing later phases of that same project. So, you know, I think Kenya is a great example of a country that is increasingly questioning the implications of a very close relationship with China. But all of that is happening in, as you know, some of the other speakers have pointed out, all of that is happening in a climate where there aren't many other options. There aren't, you know, like China stepped into Africa as a way, or like one of the reasons China became popular as a financier in Africa was because the relationship with the World Bank and other institutions was so difficult for African countries. And a lot of other lenders are not, are not really in a position to help Africa like build infrastructure that is really crucial to its development. So what happened then is that a lot of African countries, you know, realizing that they're becoming too indebted to China, then turned to bond markets, and particularly to Eurobond markets, which has actually compounded the problem. You know, so a country like Zambia, for example, is now finding itself highly indebted both to China and to Eurobond markets. And so, you know, kind of, so it actually worsened the problem for African development itself. And I think, you know, it's at the moment we're seeing some of those tensions, I think, starting to reflect in the political relationship between China and Africa. So the political relationship is becoming harder, I think. You know, Nigeria being a key example of that, the deterioration of the relationship over a while. But I think at the same time, China is going to be a really big, important partner for Africa over the next decades, I think, you know, among others, because I mean, there aren't many actors in the world who are able to actually step into the position that China occupies. And at the same time, I think we shouldn't underestimate the long-term reservations or you know, difficulties that Africa has had with its traditional partners in the West, including the Bretton Woods institutions. You know, those relationships were problematic before China stepped into the picture, and they haven't necessarily become less problematic now. You know, they are still a difficult issue for Africa to deal with, and now the relationship with China is also additionally, you know, complicated. So I think China will stay a really important partner, but it's gonna, that relationship as it matures will necessarily have to have some reckoning in terms of the inequalities inherent in the relationship, and some of the kind of crisis points we're seeing at the moment in relation to debt particularly.
Thank you, Cobus. So we are running out of time, and I realize that, you know, it's much later in some parts of the world. So I would like to thank all the speakers, Hayong, Alicia, Nicholas, Frans-Paul, and Cobus, for sharing your views on too many issues. I realize we wanted to put everything together on the economic crisis, how to move forward, which is the role of cooperation. Alicia mentioned, emphasized it. It's not in the news, how to cooperate together. I hope it will be more so. And on the reputation crisis, which goes hand in hand with the health crisis, which are going to be the impact of China's relations with different parts of the world, and how it's going to be politicized or getting more ideological. I think this is there to stay. It seems so. Thanks everybody for sharing your views, and sorry for this format and my, cumbersome kicking in with questions. I would like to remember everybody that we went out today with our annual report on China brackets, which is on Hong Kong. And it seems odd that we are out with a report on Hong Kong, but as the title is before the pandemic was decided to be Hong Kong Infinity War, maybe it's not a topic which is going to be over quite soon, and it's going to stay for quite some time. So hopefully when the pandemic will be almost over and the economic crisis will not be over for the next 10 years or so. So we will be talking about it again and again. But Hong Kong is still there, and the problems there are there to stay for many years now. So we decided to focus on that. Also within the crisis, there have been some developments. So if you want to download it, it's on the website. And thanks again to everybody who had participated to this panel. Hope to see you soon, somewhere, to follow up on these questions, because we actually have many more questions than answers as usual. And so we will gather more questions maybe in the future and try to follow up a little bit to see whether at the policy level, some aspects will be able to give a little bit of answer to our questions, because actually I think that maybe because of the lockdown, there's a lot of more in-depth thinking about many issues, but we are struggling to find answers and facts. This is my last word. Thanks. Hope you are here. Kabus, I don't hear you anymore, but I just say goodbye to everybody. Stay safe